The Wilderness Journey Life Lessons. Have you ever felt stuck, wandering through life without direction? That's exactly how the Israelites felt during their 40-year journey in the wilderness. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a test, a process of refinement that revealed their hearts and shaped their faith. After being miraculously freed from Egypt, they stood on the brink of the Promised Land, only to hesitate in fear and disbelief. They had seen God split the Red Sea, rain manna from heaven, and provide water from a rock. Yet, when faced with the challenge of entering Canaan, they doubted. Instead of trusting in the God who had already proven his power, they let fear dictate their response. As a result, the entire generation, except for Joshua and Caleb, was sentenced to wander in the wilderness until they died, never stepping into the land that had been promised to them. But their time in the wilderness was not wasted. It exposed their weaknesses, tested their trust, and forced them to rely on God. Every challenge, whether it was hunger, thirst, or an uncertain path, was an opportunity to grow in faith. Yet, time and time again, they chose to grumble rather than trust. When they lacked food, they complained instead of remembering that God had already provided. When they grew impatient, they questioned Moses' leadership rather than recognizing God's guidance. And when they faced obstacles, they longed for the familiarity of Egypt rather than embracing the freedom God was offering them. The wilderness journey mirrors our own struggles today. How often do we doubt when life doesn't go as planned? How many times do we look back at the past, even if it was filled with hardship, simply because the unknown feels too overwhelming? Just like the Israelites, we wrestle with fear, impatience, and frustration. But the lesson of the wilderness is clear. Faith is not just about believing in God's power, it's about trusting His timing and His process. God didn't lead the Israelites in circles to punish them, but to prepare them. He wanted to strip away their slave mentality and transform them into a people ready to inherit His promises. They had been freed from Egypt physically, but their hearts were still trapped in a mindset of doubt and fear. Their journey was about learning to walk in obedience, even when they didn't understand. In the end, only those who trusted God completely were able to enter the Promised Land. And the same is true for us today. Our faith journey isn't just about reaching the destination, but about becoming the kind of people who are ready to receive the blessings God has prepared for us. The cost of doubt, a generation lost. Standing at the edge of the Promised Land should have been the Israelites' greatest moment of victory. After escaping slavery in Egypt and witnessing countless miracles, plagues that broke Pharaoh's grip, the Red Sea parting before their eyes, manna falling from heaven daily, they were finally at the doorstep of the land God had promised their ancestors. But instead of stepping forward in faith, they hesitated. Fear took hold. Doubt overpowered trust. And in that moment, their destiny changed forever. Moses sent 12 spies into Canaan to scout the land, a place flowing with milk and honey, just as God had said. The spies returned with proof of its abundance: giant clusters of grapes, rich produce, and fertile land. But 10 of the spies couldn't see past the obstacles. The people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large, they reported. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Numbers 13:28-33. Their words spread fear like wildfire through the camp. Instead of remembering the God who had conquered Egypt for them, the Israelites focused on the size of their enemies. That night, the entire nation broke down in panic. They cried out, accusing Moses of leading them to their deaths, and even spoke of choosing a new leader to take them back to Egypt, back to slavery, back to the very place they had begged God to rescue them from. Only 2 men, Joshua and Caleb, stood firm, urging the people to trust in God's promise. But the fear of the majority drowned out their faith. God's response was swift and severe. "Not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, except Caleb and Joshua." Numbers 14:30. For every day the spies spent scouting the land, the Israelites would spend a year wandering the wilderness, 40 years in total, until every adult from that fearful generation had died. They would never see the land they had longed for, not because God wasn't faithful, but because they refused to believe in His power. Their story is a sobering reminder of how doubt can steal destiny. God had already given them victory, but they let fear convince them otherwise. They had seen miracles with their own eyes, yet still hesitated when it mattered most. The consequence was devastating. An entire generation perished without ever stepping into their inheritance. Today, the same choice stands before us. Do we trust God even when the future looks uncertain? Do we believe in His promises, or do we allow fear to keep us wandering in circles? The Israelites' failure wasn't a lack of strength, it was a lack of faith, and in the end, that made all the difference. The tragic rebellions that changed everything. Throughout their time in the wilderness, the Israelites didn't just struggle with fear and doubt, they openly rebelled against God's leadership. Again and again, they tested His patience, questioning His authority and rejecting the very leaders He had chosen to guide them. These rebellions were not just acts of defiance. They had devastating consequences, costing many their lives and proving that challenging God's order always comes at a price. One of the earliest and most dangerous revolts came from within Moses' own family. His sister, Miriam, and brother, Aaron, grew jealous of his position and questioned why God had placed him above them. "Has the Lord spoken only through Moses?" they asked. "Hasn't He also spoken through us?" Numbers 12:2. But their challenge wasn't just about leadership, it was about pride. God's response was swift. Miriam was struck with leprosy, her skin turning deathly white. Though Moses interceded for her, she was forced to spend 7 days in isolation outside the camp, a public display of the cost of her arrogance. But perhaps the most infamous rebellion came from a man named Korah, along with 250 influential leaders. They accused Moses and Aaron of elevating themselves above the community, declaring the whole assembly as holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them. Numbers 16:3. What made Korah's rebellion so dangerous was that it disguised itself as a call for equality. But underneath, it was a power grab, a direct challenge to the authority God had established. Moses, instead of defending himself, let God decide. He proposed a test. Korah and his followers would present incense before the Lord, and He would reveal whom He had truly chosen. The next day, as the rebels stood ready, something terrifying happened. The ground beneath them split open. Fire then consumed the 250 men who had dared to claim the priesthood for themselves. Their rebellion was met with one of the most severe judgments in Israel's history. Yet, even after witnessing this, the people still didn't learn. The very next day, they accused Moses of killing the Lord's people. In response, a plague broke out, killing 14,700 more before Aaron ran into the midst of the dying with his incense, standing between the living and the dead to stop the destruction. Numbers 16:41-50. These rebellions weren't just about disobedience. They revealed a deep-rooted resistance to trusting God's appointed leadership. The lesson is clear. Pride, jealousy, and defiance against God's order lead only to destruction. Israel's wilderness journey wasn't just about reaching the promised land. It was about learning to submit to God's will. For those who refused, the price was their lives. Moses' defining mistake, a moment that changed everything. For 40 years, Moses had faithfully led the Israelites through the wilderness. He had stood before Pharaoh, called down plagues, parted the Red Sea, and interceded for the people countless times when they rebelled. He had carried the weight of their complaints, their doubts, and their disobedience. But in one moment of frustration, one act of disobedience, he lost the very thing he had been leading them toward: entry into the Promised Land. The scene took place in the wilderness of Zin, near Kadesh, where the Israelites once again found themselves without water. Instead of trusting that God would provide as he always had, they turned on Moses and Aaron in anger. "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness?" they cried. "There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food." Numbers 24:5. Their complaints were nothing new. They had made the same accusations before, ignoring God's past miracles and focusing only on their present discomfort. As he had done many times before, Moses went before God, and God gave him a simple command: "Take the staff, speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water." Numbers 28. It was a clear instruction. Moses was to speak to the rock, and water would flow. But by this point, Moses was exhausted. The constant rebellion, the endless complaints, the sheer weight of leadership had taken its toll. Instead of following God's command exactly, frustration got the better of him. He stood before the people and snapped, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" Numbers 20:10. Then, instead of speaking to the rock, he struck it twice with his staff. Water still flowed, and the people drank, but something far greater had been lost. God's response was immediate and devastating. "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." Numbers 20:12. With that one act, Moses sealed his fate. After decades of leadership, he would see the Promised Land from a distance, but he would never enter it. Moses' mistake wasn't just about striking the rock, it was about misrepresenting God. By acting in anger, he made it seem as though God was harsh and reluctant to provide, when in reality, God was showing mercy. He also took credit for the miracle, saying, "Must we bring you water?" instead of pointing to God as the source. His failure is a sobering reminder that obedience matters. Even the most faithful can fall short when frustration overtakes faith. In the end, Moses' story teaches us that honoring God's holiness is more important than simply getting results, because one moment of disobedience can cost us more than we ever imagined. Powerful symbols, lessons from the bronze serpent, Aaron's staff, and the cities of refuge. Throughout the Israelites' journey in the wilderness, God used powerful symbols to teach them deep spiritual truths, lessons that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. Three of the most significant were the bronze serpent, Aaron's budding staff, and the cities of refuge. Each one carried a message of divine authority, redemption, and the power of faith. One of the most striking moments in the wilderness came when the Israelites once again turned against God and Moses, complaining about their hardships. Their rebellion led to God sending venomous snakes among them, and many died as a result. In desperation, the people repented and begged Moses to intercede for them. Instead of simply removing the snakes, God instructed Moses to create a bronze serpent and lift it high on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live. Numbers 21:8. Those who obeyed and looked at the bronze serpent were healed instantly. At first glance, the command seemed strange. Why would God use the very image of their affliction as the source of their healing? The answer lay in the deeper spiritual truth this moment foreshadowed. Centuries later, Jesus would say, "Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes may have eternal life in him." John 3:14. 15. The bronze serpent was a prophetic image of Christ on the cross. Just as the Israelites were saved by looking in faith at the serpent, we are saved by looking to Jesus, who took our sin upon himself. Another powerful symbol was Aaron's budding staff. After Korah's rebellion against Moses and Aaron, God settled the matter of spiritual authority once and for all. He commanded that each tribe place a staff before him, and the next day Aaron's staff had sprouted, blossomed, and even produced almonds, Numbers 17:8. This miraculous sign confirmed that Aaron's priesthood was divinely appointed, not based on human ambition. The lesson was clear: God chooses his leaders, and his authority cannot be challenged without consequence. The cities of refuge provided yet another symbol of God's justice and mercy. These 6 cities were designated as places of safety for anyone who had accidentally killed someone. Instead of being hunted down by avengers, they could flee to a city of refuge and remain there until the high priest died. Numbers 35. This system foreshadowed Christ, our ultimate refuge. Just as these cities provided protection, Jesus offers salvation to all who seek him. And just as the death of the high priest secured freedom for the accused, Christ's death secured freedom for all who trust in him. Through these symbols, God showed Israel and us that faith, divine authority, and redemption are not abstract ideas. They are real, tangible, and deeply personal, pointing us to the ultimate fulfillment found in Christ. A new generation rises, the transition from Moses to Joshua. After 40 years of wandering, the Israelites stood once again on the threshold of the Promised Land. But this was not the same group that had fled Egypt decades earlier. The entire generation that had doubted God at the edge of Canaan was now gone, their bodies buried in the wilderness. Only Joshua and Caleb remained from that first census, the 2 who had believed in God's promise when others had feared. Now, a new generation stood ready, but before they could enter the land, a critical transition had to take place. Moses, the great leader who had guided them through every trial, would not be the one to lead them into Canaan. His failure at Meribah, where he struck the rock instead of speaking to it as God commanded, had cost him the privilege of entering the land. Numbers 20:12. Though he had faithfully interceded for the people, received God's law, and stood in the very presence of the Almighty, his time as Israel's leader was coming to an end. This moment was both heartbreaking and necessary. Moses had carried the people out of slavery, but it would take a new leader to bring them into their inheritance. God had already chosen Joshua as Moses' successor. Unlike the generation before him, Joshua had no fear of the giants in Canaan. He had seen the land with his own eyes and believed in God's ability to deliver it into Israel's hands. But before he could step into leadership, Moses had one final responsibility: to ensure the transition was clear and that the people knew who would lead them next. In Numbers 27:18-23, God commanded Moses to lay his hands on Joshua in front of the entire assembly, commissioning him as the new leader. This was a public declaration, leaving no room for doubt or rebellion. Joshua would not lead in his own strength. God's Spirit was upon him, and he was to follow God's commands just as Moses had. This transition of leadership carried an important lesson. God's plan is never dependent on one person. Even the greatest leaders are temporary, but God's mission continues. Moses was irreplaceable in many ways, yet Israel would move forward without him, because their true leader was always God. For the new generation, this was also a moment of decision. They had heard stories of Egypt, of miracles, of failure. But now, the choice was theirs. Would they follow Joshua in faith, or would they repeat their parents' mistakes? Today, the same truth remains. Faith must be personal. No one can inherit faith from the past generation. They must choose it for themselves. The question is, will we be like those who hesitated in fear, or like Joshua, who stepped boldly into God's promise? Lessons from the wilderness: faith, obedience, and the cost of hesitation. The Israelites' journey through the wilderness wasn't just about reaching a destination. It was about becoming the kind of people who could inherit the promised land. They had been freed from slavery in Egypt, but their hearts still clung to fear, doubt, and rebellion. Through every trial, God was teaching them to trust Him, to follow His leadership, and to walk in obedience. But not everyone learned the lesson. The first generation had everything they needed to succeed. They had seen miracles with their own eyes: God splitting the Red Sea, raining manna from heaven, bringing water from a rock. But when the moment of faith came, they hesitated. They stood at the edge of Canaan, the land God had promised them. But instead of stepping forward, they looked at the giants in the land and froze. Fear controlled them more than faith, and in that moment, their destiny changed. Because they refused to trust God, they were sentenced to wander the wilderness for 40 years, dying without ever setting foot in the land they longed for. But the next generation was different. They had grown up in the wilderness, witnessing both the faithfulness of God and the failures of their parents. When their time came, they didn't hesitate. Under Joshua's leadership, they stepped into the promised land and claimed what God had promised. The difference between the two generations wasn't what they had seen, it was how they responded. This story isn't just ancient history. It's a reflection of the choices we face today. How often do we stand at the edge of something God is calling us to, only to hesitate in fear? How many times do we miss out on blessings because we're too focused on the obstacles in front of us? The Israelite story is a warning. If we let doubt rule our hearts, we may wander aimlessly instead of walking in God's promises. Think about how this applies to real life. Maybe God is calling you to step out in faith, to start something new, to move forward in your purpose, to trust Him in uncertainty, but you're afraid. Maybe you've been stuck in a cycle of waiting, like the Israelites, feeling like you're going in circles. The truth is, hesitation can be more costly than failure. The Israelites didn't lose their blessing because God abandoned them. They lost it because they didn't believe enough to step forward. The question remains, which generation will we be like? Will we be those who hesitate and lose what God has for us? Or will we be like Joshua's generation, ready to trust, obey, and claim the promises set before us? The wilderness is not meant to last forever, but only those with faith will step into what comes next.